It really strikes me that this is exactly what Pope Leo meant by shared discernment, is what we're doing here today, and it's really a privilege to participate in that with you all. So I'm incredibly glad that I'm not the first speaker, or even the second, that we've had this incredibly rich morning with the kind of interpretations and appropriations of Magnifica Humanitas that we've had with this extremely positive and appreciative note. I'm going to offer something slightly more critical. Because I only have 30 minutes, I'm going to not say all of the things that I think are wonderful and brilliant and absolutely necessary about this document. My basic reaction when I read it was, thank God we have a pope. You know, just the overwhelming feeling of sanity that you get from Catholic social teaching. You're like, thank goodness, some sanity about our shared issues. So that's the context of what I'm going to say. But within that, I'm going to raise some critical questions. So there's obviously been a huge wave of reaction to Magnifica Humanitas. That's one of the things that's really encouraging about the last few weeks, the quantity of commentaries and reactions and interpretations and so on. I'm going to examine an aspect which I think has been really neglected, which is its relationship with the document which seems to be its most natural pair, and that is Laudato Si. Before I embark on that, I want to make one general comment, which is this, that I think the single most important contribution of Magnifica Humanitas has nothing to do with AI as such. And it doesn't even have to do with the substantive content of the document in a way. It has to do with making possible and modeling a certain genre of speech in public debate. I listened to The Rest is Politics, maybe some of you did as well, and I laughed out loud when Alistair Campbell called Magnifica Humanitas, which he continued to mispronounce, an unusual document. Of course, it's actually not unusual at all for those of us in the trade, but he was making an important point, which is that in the context of our public conversation, it is unusual. It is. And it has nevertheless planted in our shared conversation a possibility, picking up on this theme of possibility, of a certain way of thinking or feeling or imagining. AI obviously presented the perfect opportunity to do this because it so obviously raised the question of what it means to be human. But the point is really not that a set of moral claims has been made, but rather that a style or sensibility of practical reason has been modeled. And that's not to downplay its highly salient interventions in all kinds of specific technical questions which are very granular, as was observed. It's simply to say that I think its real gift is that it makes certain kinds of question askable in a public space. You know, to hear Alistair Campbell saying, what does it mean to be human? On this incredibly widely listened to talk show, I thought that was a huge achievement. So that's the only general comment I'll make, that I, as someone who cares a lot that this kind of discourse flourishes, it's the most enormous gift that it's enabled that. However, it has had this effect in part by offering its substantive content in a way that wasn't too offensive to established sensibilities. That's a characterization which definitely doesn't fit Laudato Si. And that itself calls for some critical discernment, which I will do now. As I compare Magnifica Humanitas and Laudato Si, I'm going to be proposing that we should read Magnifica Humanitas within the framework of integral ecology. I would have liked to see that integration undertaken within Magnifica Humanitas, but as it stands, it's a task that falls to us as we take this document forward. So the first point of comparison is the project of building in Magnifica Humanitas over against the contemplative paradigm in Laudato Si. What the ecological crisis and AI have in common is that at the core of both is the human relationship to technology. The assessment of this relationship requires an anthropology, and both Magnifica Humanitas and Laudato Si are essentially anthropologies, but they diverge in rather an important way. The continuity is clearest in the adoption by Pope Leo of this central concept from Laudato Si, which is the technocratic paradigm. I don't have to define that because we've all heard it discussed this morning. Magnifica Humanitas adds to the concept of the technocratic paradigm an additional one, the so-called culture of power. But within the context of this continuity, and it's important, by the way, when popes pick up on concepts used by previous popes, they're saying, this is here to stay. This is something we need to continue to use and deepen and deploy. So it's a significant continuity. But within the context of that, it didn't escape the notice of many that Laudato Si seemed quite anti-progress and anti-technological, and these criticisms seem to have shaped the way that Magnifica Humanitas is framed. Leo never, and this was already observed, Leo never misses an opportunity to stress that the Church is not against either progress or technology. That's, I think, not a cosmetic difference. Let me try to explain. The counterpoint to the technocratic paradigm in Laudato Si is what Pope Francis calls the contemplative paradigm. These are the opposites. This is where the road diverges. The contemplative paradigm is a way of seeing which is the diametric opposite to the technocratic paradigm. It sees the world, that is, it sees the world first of all as a gift to be received. It accords absolute priority, morally and spiritually, to what it calls the contemplative. And that obviously doesn't mean that we should all go and become contemplatives in the sense of a state of life, but more that we should cultivate a disposition of wonder and gratitude as the foundation of any subsequent attempt to change the world. The contemplative paradigm, I think, is best expressed in my favorite sentence from Laudato Si, which is a very quotable document. Rather than a problem to be solved, the world is a joyful mystery to be contemplated with gladness and praise. The technocratic paradigm frames the world as a series of problems. It's a mentality we might call solutionism. But our first and enduring task, according to Laudato Si, is that which is stated in the opening lines of every Eucharistic prayer and the opening lines of Laudato Si itself. Praise be to you. It is our duty and our salvation always and everywhere to give thanks. Not to do anything else, just to give thanks. The ontology of Laudato Si places the accent entirely on this giftedness of creation and the common origin of creation in God the giver, which is the ground of the fraternity that makes us call all creatures sister and brother. It's precisely because they are given by the one God. We all have this shared origin. That's the ground of creation's fraternity. To address other creatures as brother and sister is not a sentiment. It's a recognition of what they actually are. So the anthropology of Laudato Si is shaped in this deep way by receptivity. To use a language which is mine and not from the encyclicals, in Laudato Si, the human being is primarily homo adorans, who is not called mainly to intervene or shape the world, but to receive it as a gift. And the work of praise, speaking of work, is the first work. Now think about the governing imagery of Magnifica Humanitas. The governing imagery there is that of building. Its anthropology is that of homo faber. Man is the maker. And our human task is to build God's city. The human being here is not mainly a contemplative who offers the world back to God as a priest, but mainly an agent of his own destiny. There are various questions one might raise about the imagery of building. Anna mentioned some earlier to do with its kind of biblical appropriateness and others to do with the theologies of grace. What I'm troubled by in the metaphor of building is the contrast it has with the contemplative paradigm. It suggests that our primary human task is a task of doing rather than the task of being and receiving. I think it's important to notice we often gain an appreciation for the distinctive quality of a particular material, of a particular magisterial output, when we notice the way in which it departs from its predecessors. So I think this imagery of building, it's important to pay a lot of attention to that. So that's my first contrast, the project of building versus the contemplative paradigm. Obviously, I'm using the word versus in a kind of limited way. Clearly, there's a higher level of integration, which is what we're searching for, but I'm drawing attention to these tensions. The second area that I wanted to speak about is the different ways in which they understand the human relationship to the body. The root of this call in Laudato Si for the contemplative paradigm is a strong doctrine of what used to be called natural law. I think it's better in the contemporary environment to call it something like the given integrity of nature. This is something we don't change in the Church's social doctrine. We don't change the given integrity of nature. We simply learn to listen to it. We receive what it is. And by this humble listening, we discern the limits and parameters of our life on earth. The theme of limit is very strong in the Anthropology of Magnifica Humanitas. There's a beautiful narration of human vulnerability and the role of mistakes and disappointments and failures in our personal biographies, but it is quite striking that in Magnifica Humanitas, an analogous respect for the limits of this living planet is mentioned only once. This is rather unfortunate, because the human belonging to the living world has to be the structuring framework for both anthropology and ethics. Paragraph 237 describes humans as embedded in creation. But this is much less radical language than Laudato Si, which doesn't represent the human being as nestled into the living world, but as integrated into the living world in a single tissue of organic being. Integral ecology is mentioned twice in Magnifica Humanitas. This was already mentioned. The most important of these two mentions is the following, paragraph 84. Today, the concept of integral human development is a benchmark for the valuation of integral ecology. This is, of course, true. But it would be possible to state it much more radically than that, as you would find in Laudato Si. Integral ecology is the active condition of any integral humanism. In a worrying trend which I have seen in other magisterial documents, in Magnifica Humanitas, something called care for creation appears several times as an item in a list. But care for creation is not one of the things that human beings must do. It is the sine qua non of our existence. We fatally misconstrue our situation if we think of ecology as an aspect of anthropology. Insofar as we are constitutively and not accidentally embodied, we cannot talk about the human person at all apart from our being constituted by and in an ecological matrix. So this is what I would call a kind of muteness of a fully ecologized anthropology. That's at the level of the human being's relationship with the wider creation. Now I want to move on specifically to the human relationship with the human being's own body. And this, I think, is also weak in the document. This weakness is all the more surprising given that the document addresses artificial intelligence, because the central philosophical issue raised by AI for philosophical anthropology is organicity. That is to say, being organic, being biologically alive, as opposed to some other analogous kind of life. Being a living body, in the view of classical Catholic anthropology, is not a feature of our identity, like, I don't know, living in England or having brown hair. It's the exclusive condition of my human identity, permanently. As organic, my body cannot exist except as a relationship with the living world. And For the same reason, in the short paragraph, beautiful paragraph about artificial intelligence, the things that artificial intelligence doesn't have, it's mentioned that artificial intelligence doesn't have a body, but that's really not strong enough. The not having a body of AI is its all-determining characteristic considered as intelligence. I'll say more about this in a second. Magnifica Humanitas refers the reader to pre-existing magisterial teaching on the nature of artificial intelligence, and I'm respecting that. It doesn't attempt to give a full analysis of what artificial intelligence is within the pages of the document. And I happen to think some of that material that it refers to is very good. But nevertheless, Magnifica Humanitas actually uses organic language for artificial intelligence, such as cultivated and grown. And by doing that, in my own view, it gives far too much away. There are quote marks around these terms, which of course is a subtle indicator that they are metaphors, but they're metaphors in a very leading way. The appearance of these terms, I think, is a big win for the AI companies who sell their products much more effectively the more organicized they are. The more they are made to seem like a living thing or a human thing, the easier they are to market, the easier they are to narrate, the easier they are to trust. Why is it not appropriate to use these metaphors? For the following reason: because the very meaning of intelligence itself, when the subject has no body, is totally equivocal as compared to intelligence exercised by an embodied subject. Equivocal means it doesn't have almost any continuity of meaning. Magnifica Humanitas, of course, does stress the absolute uniqueness of human intelligence and experience. But I was looking for something much more incisive. When terms from human experience, emotion, and thought are applied to AI, it isn't analogous, it's equivocal. We know only as subjects with a biography, a body which has passed through space and time and is subject at every moment to a billion visible and invisible material effects. We literally cannot imagine what it would mean to know, feel, love, and so on, except as physical beings. Our every thought is modulated by our physicality. Perhaps I can put it like this: it is actually appropriate to speak, and we should speak, of non-human animals with analogies taken from human thought and emotion. It is inappropriate to speak of AI that way. Of course, the decision to call AI intelligence, artificial intelligence, was a totally commercially driven decision, not a philosophically driven decision. Some of you might have read Bruno Latour's fabulous little book, If We Lose the Earth, We Lose Our Souls, little collection of posthumous essays. He points out that Christian theology itself has been quite slow to fully reckon with and integrate our own organic embodiment. There are, in fact, hugely promising new adventures in philosophical theology now to that end. But the condition of being organic, of organicity, is precisely what we need to pay attention to in the age of AI as far as anthropology is concerned. And there's an additional dimension to this. It is precisely in this failure to recognize and acknowledge our own organic embodiedness, that is to say, our solidarity, our complete solidarity with the living world, that the ecological crisis has its root. And yet Magnifica Humanitas doesn't quite spell out the interior connection between these two crises. One could have offered a very emphatic illumination of the essential continuity between our two predicaments, one created by artificial intelligence, one created by the ecological crisis. The thing about AI is it disembodies us yet further, and therefore it actually amplifies the ecological crisis, not only in the obvious sense of being highly environmentally damaging in a material sense, but also because it once again separates us from our embodied reality, both here and everywhere. So next, a word about its assessment of artificial intelligence. And here I'm going to be touching on some themes that have already been spoken about. Leo rightly rejects, of course, a too simple contrast between techno-optimism and techno-pessimism. The question, he says, is not whether we endorse a given technology or not. It's whether that technology serves our humanity. And when it comes to the potential of the AI revolution to amplify imbalanced power, Magnifica Humanitas is really at its best, drawing constant attention to the non-neutrality of technology. It's always being an instrument of some vision or other, a vision which is baked into the design decisions that are made before the technology ever reaches our hands. Where Magnifica Humanitas is weaker is in considering the possibility, and I offer this slightly adventurously because this is a practical judgment that you may not agree with, considering the possibility that a given technology may be intrinsically dehumanizing, not just because of the way it is designed, but because of what it fundamentally is. My sense is that the very weakness of the theme of human embodiment means that Magnifica Humanitas is not well prepared to state what is, in my view, clearly the case, which is that the digital medium produces almost ipso facto, that is, by the very fact of being digital, a sense of disconnection from our own bodies, the bodies of those around us, and the living world. I find it especially ironic that the tech gurus have operationalized the concept of connection and connectivity, which AI supposedly serves, when in fact this medium by its very nature disconnects us. As a meta-thought, digitality is, of course, in the end just a series of noughts and ones. It's reductionist almost in its very constitution. When it becomes at the same time powerfully attractive, and AI is used to make it yet more attractive, and I'm talking particularly now about large language models, which have direct interfaces with human users, it's hard to imagine this technology being anything other than dehumanizing. Again, that's a practical judgment, and I'd be interested in people's views about that. All right, my final sort of area of critical remark is what I call death by distraction. This is to do with the way that Magnifica Humanitas is playing in the public space, in view of the fact that integral ecology is not a very prominent theme in it. There is a nascent, well, it's not nascent actually, it's a pretty established public narrative and media narrative that the real issue facing human beings now is AI. In the meantime, climate and nature fall off the agenda, and in fact have fallen off the agenda almost completely as far as the media is concerned. This narrative, of course, is not innocent at all. The tech giants, whose unaccountable power is critiqued brilliantly in Magnifica Humanitas, have every interest in sponsoring a public impression that AI is the real story. They have a proven track record in announcing an imminent apocalypse, attracting huge media hype, absorbing the world's attention in febrile speculation about whatever's going to happen next, and then quietly letting the matter drop for a while until people are ready for another round of sensationalist news. And actually, if you look back over the past decade, this kind of boom-bust cycle of media-driven fear about AI is a pretty steady pattern. In this particular landscape, one needs to take care that Magnifica Humanitas doesn't become an unwitting agent of what I call death by distraction. Because while AI occupies headlines, fossil fuel emissions continue to rise. The world continues to get hotter. Coral reefs go on dying. Rainforests continue to be felled. The world's oceans continue to be emptied. Billions of non-human creatures live grotesquely defaced lives in our industrial factory farms, and so on. And the multitudes of human beings who are so vulnerable to the ecological crisis are once again pushed to the edge of the politics, the edge of our political conversation, the edge of the media, and the edge of consciousness altogether. The task of interpreting Magnifica Humanitas has to somehow ensure that it doesn't have this effect of reinforcing an exclusive focus on AI. This is, of course, not to say that the Church's social teaching shouldn't develop a detailed response to AI, and thank God it has and is. It's more to say that the way in which this response is joined up with integral ecology really matters. We need to read Magnifica Humanitas through the lens of integral ecology. And I take that task not to be primarily a task of critique, but primarily a concrete response to Leo's call for shared discernment. Final word about this. The AI revolution has obvious intersections with climate and nature, and the encyclical draws attention to these. But within this integral approach, there is a vital asymmetry between the two issues. To take AI to be the real issue, while relegating climate and nature to a secondary place, is like someone making a career plan while sitting on a branch that is about to snap. The order of creation, whose integrity is stated over and over again in the Church's social teaching, contains what I would call an immutable taxonomy. There is just an order of things. And in that taxonomy, the absolute condition of the common good is a habitable earth. There is no healthy relationship with AI without a habitable earth. We can't have a problem with AI if we can't eat, drink, and breathe. So we need to somehow resist this narrative that there are these two issues side by side that are comparable. My own view is they aren't comparable. The AI issue the AI crisis, as it were, unfolds within this wider crisis, which is what the integral ecology framework is supposed to address. So, to conclude, I wish I could now say all of the brilliant things about Magnifica Humanitas to make myself feel better. It is, of course, a true landmark, this document, and it makes the strongest possible statement about the beauty and finality of our own humanness, which couldn't be more vital. And the weaknesses that I have adverted to, in one aspect, function actually as strengths, as far as the reception of the Church's social teaching is concerned. Laudato Si's reception, both within and outside of the Church, was uneven, still is uneven. The very radicality of its proclamation provoked pushback. It was a document full of prophetic denunciation, even more so its underreported successor, Laudate Deum. Global leaders and all who benefit from extractivist industries and all of us who turn away from the ecological crisis were called out in the strongest possible language. Magnifica Humanitas, in contrast, is rather solicitous in tone. It was welcomed by the tech industry and celebrated even by J.D. Vance. Whether this should be mourned or celebrated, I am honestly not sure, but it certainly enables impact. The takeaway for me is this: it is not enough just to shout, humanism, humanism. It is not enough to just say we need to think about the human. We need to specify as precisely as possible what the human being is. Magnifica Humanitas is, like all of the great magisterial documents, an ouverture. It's an opening. It needs to be played out, deepened, extended, concretized, and so on. And I'm suggesting to you that integral ecology is the conceptuality in which we can undertake that task. Thank you.